Okay, you guys, welcome to episode 5 of the Crime with Kylie podcast. Now, I'm sure you guys noticed, but this episode is a bit different. I mean, maybe if you're an audio-only listener anyways, it's not too different, but to try to make more podcasts for you guys per week, I've been trying to film and add some audio-only podcasts. So I hope you guys enjoy. Now, the case we're going to be talking about today is the case of the Alcasser girls. And to this day, 31 years later, the girls have not gotten justice. And it is unknown whether or not we will ever know the complete truth. 3 teenage girls set off on a night that was supposed to be one of fun, joy, and dancing, but instead ended up being a night of torture and torment that ultimately ended in their demise. And it is unknown whether or not we will ever know the complete truth. Now, one last thing before we fully get started, I would like to add that in today's episode, we will be talking about graphic content that includes child torture, child kidnapping, child death, and the rape of multiple children. And these topics are very difficult to talk about, let alone listen to, so if that is not for you today, that is completely fine, and feel free to tune back into another episode where we will not be talking about those topics as heavily. I mean no disrespect to the victims or the families when I talk about these cases. I am simply trying to spread awareness, especially when cases are unsolved or when justice wasn't completely served. With all of that said, let's get into the case. Today we are going back to the year 1992 in Alcasser, just outside of Valencia, Spain. 3 teen girls, Miriam Garcia Iborra, Antonia, or Tony, Gomez Rodriguez, and Desirée Hernandez were eager to have a night out at a popular nightclub called Cooler in nearby Picassent. But when they couldn't find a ride, their lives would take a dark and tragic turn. But who were the girls? What were they like? Miriam was very academically inclined, and she absolutely loved school. She attended school, however, another town away, and despite going to this other school, she didn't really make too many friends there and was very quiet and reclusive. However, she always looked forward to school ending so that way she could come back home to Alcasser and hang out with Desirée and Tony. 14-year-old Miriam had 2 parents who loved her very much, a few siblings, and she also really enjoyed writing poetry in her free time. Tony, who was 15 years old, was the opposite of academically inclined, but she was looking forward to turning 16 so that way she could start working. And although she did want to work and save and have a good work ethic, a big part of it is because she loved to shop and she was looking forward to getting a job so that way she could get money to buy new clothes. And Desirée was 14 years old and she was the most athletically inclined and also strong-willed of the 3 of them. If anyone was going to stand up for her friends, it was Desirée. And despite all of their different personalities, they complemented each other beautifully, and every chance they got, they were hanging out. They were usually walking around town together or going to the different teen dance nightclubs. And that is exactly what they planned to do the night of November 13th of 1992. And that day, which happened to be Friday the 13th, started off like any other day. Miriam went to her school a town away, Desirée went to her classes, and Tony skipped out on school and was actually hanging out with a friend of hers named Esther. And that night, the 3 girls, well, 4 actually including Esther, were planning on going to this teen nightclub called The Cooler, which you actually had to buy tickets beforehand to actually get in. However, the girls never did, so it was unknown whether the girls were planning on trying to bribe their way in or if they knew someone who was going to let them in anyways. And the girls were all supposed to meet at Esther's house, and then they were hoping to get a ride to Picassent to the Cooler. However, Esther ended up being sick with a flu that was going around, so the girls ended up meeting at her house anyways, but Esther was not going to go. And that night of November 13th of 1992, Miriam called her dad Fernando and asked him if he could give the girls a ride to Picassent. However, instead of her dad answering the phone, it was actually her mom who answered the phone, and her mom said no because her dad Fernando was sick with the same flu. And because of this, her mom even suggested that they don't go. But instead of changing their plans, the girls decided that they would instead hitchhike. After all, it wasn't that far. At the most, it was about a 30 to 35 minute walk. And the night of November 13th was a very cold and chilly night, but the girls were dressed ready to dance. They were dressed as though they were just going to go out for a short time and then be back home. and I'm pretty sure it was Tony who had plans to go eat dinner with her family that night. And they embarked on their hitchhiking journey at about 8 o'clock p.m. And at some point during their walk, a couple picked them up along the way and offered to take them to Peak Ascent because the guy in the couple was going to go get his car fixed at an automobile shop over there. However, when they all arrived in Peak Ascent, the couple ended up dropping the girls off at a gas station because the automobile shop they were going to was going to be way past where the nightclub was, so it would have been a shorter distance for them to go to the gas station to the club. And as the girls were walking from the gas station to the club, which was near the town center, they spotted a friend from school, and this friend was Jose A. Cano. And he recounted that the girls stopped, said hi to him, and then continued on their walk. And this is where the timeline of events starts to get a bit blurred because there was one other eyewitness who saw the girls that night. And this was an older woman who lived in Peak Ascent, and from her home she saw the 3 girls get into a small white sedan with 2 men. And the woman said that this was around 8 o'clock p.m., but if the girls left at 8 o'clock p.m., that doesn't quite make sense. But I guess since no one really saw the girls leave except for Esther, and no one knows exactly where they were between Esther's house and the couple picking them up, that can explain why the timeline is a bit off. Now, after those 2 men allegedly picked the girls up, the girls were never seen alive again, and they never even made it to the nightclub either. As the hours passed and the girls failed to return home, their families grew increasingly worried. Their worries first began with all of the parents calling each other and asking, "Are they at your house? Are they at your house?" But none of the parents really knew where the girls were. Their concerns soon turned into terror when the girls' fate remained unknown. Desperate to find their loved ones, the families launched a search effort while the entire nation watched in shock and sadness through the unprecedented television coverage. And leading the search efforts was Fernando, Miriam's father. The girls' families went on the news stations and pleaded for their girls to come home. They asked for anyone with any information to come forward, but no one really did. 24 hours after the girls had gone missing, Saturday, November 14th of 1992, the girls' parents decided to go to the authorities. They urged the authorities to launch a missing persons investigation for their daughters, but because the girls were teenagers, the authorities just brushed them off. They assumed that the girls were runaways despite the evidence that indicated otherwise. For instance, Desirée had a sports bag packed for the very next day. Miriam had a lockbox at home with a lot of money in it, and none of the money was missing. Antonia had just dedicated a song on the radio to another friend who she had plans to be with the next day. Pretty soon, days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The entire country of Spain was holding its breath, and pretty soon the highest powers of Spain got involved. The Spanish Interior Minister, José Luis Conquera, intervened, orchestrating a massive joint operation to locate the girls. The Unit of Central Operations, or the UCO, emerged, setting its sights on a resolution. However, amidst this, the fabric of justice began to fray. The bodies of Tony, Desirée, and Miriam were found, buried in a shallow grave in La Ramona. The search went on for almost 3 months until January 27th of 1993, when a horrific discovery was found. La Ramona was a small town with a population around 2,000, but outside of the basic suburbs in the very center of La Ramona, most of the outside were just hills and ruins and grassy areas, most of these areas being entirely desolate. However, on that day of January 27th, 2 men, Gabriel Gonzalez and one of his children's in-laws, Jose Sala, went to go check on their beehives. Gabriel was a retired farmer, and as a hobby, he picked up beekeeping. However, instead of keeping the hives and the bees near his home, he kept them in the more rural countryside. That morning, the 2 men parked at the end of a dusty road and looked up at the beehives that Gabriel tended. Nearby their beehives were the ruins of a long-abandoned house. However, before they checked on the bees, they wanted to wait until the weather got a little bit warmer, so they decided to take a 20 to 30 minute walk around the area. As they waited, Jose lit a cigarette and began smoking as Gabriel walked around. 20 minutes into his walk, Gabriel noticed something shining out of the corner of his eye. And because this was very unusual, Gabriel went to investigate. While he was walking to go investigate the object further, he called Jose over to come with him. As the 2 men approached the object, they soon noticed a trench, and this trench had shrubs and different branches covering it, as if someone was trying to hide something. And it wasn't long after that they realized what the object was. It was a watch, a Mickey Mouse watch. And this watch was still attached to its wearer. And if you thought that the investigation was mishandled from the very beginning, You're absolutely right. However, it only got worse. After the girls' bodies were found, the entire investigation was plagued with incompetence. Judge Jose Luis Bort took hours to reach the crime scene due to his involvement in another case. The bodies were excavated without proper documentation or thorough investigation, compromising the integrity of the crime scene altogether. Strangely, the day that the girls' bodies were found, the local task force responsible for the investigation was being replaced, which led to lack of proper supervision during the crucial initial moments of the discovery. This mismanagement would cast a shadow over the entire case for years to come. The girls' bodies were found wrapped in a greenish rug, and the scene contained various items including clothing and pieces of paper. A lot of the evidence found appeared to be what to us would look like garbage. And all of this garbage was in the trench with the girls. However, because no photos were taken, it is honestly unknown where these pieces of garbage or evidence were around the girls. How far it was into the trench, where it was around their bodies, it is truly unknown. And it's important to note that all of the girls were found stacked on top of each other in the trench, with Tony on top, which is how they spotted Tony's Mickey Mouse watch. Each were in various states of decomposition. The only photo of all of this evidence or garbage was taken after it was all pulled out of the trench and just laid on the ground. Shockingly, these pieces of evidence were even further mishandled when the authorities failed to put them in plastic bags. So any DNA found on these items was null and void because it could have been from someone investigating the crime scene. There were so few investigators that the photographer who was supposed to be taking photos of the crime scene had to help them investigate instead of taking photos. So the only photos of the girls in the trench literally just looks like a pile of dirt with some oddities in it. You really can't tell much from this photo. And as we've previously discussed, the crime scene had a lot of discarded odds and ends. Amongst the heaps of irrelevant debris, investigators actually found a piece of evidence that was a gold mine. Pieces of paper, seemingly disconnected, were pieced back together like an intricate puzzle. And the name that emerged from this jigsaw puzzle was none other than Enrique Anglés Martins. Now hold on to that name because we are going to weave it into the fabric of this perplexing case. The fragments of paper turned into a pamphlet from the University Hospital of La Fe. The healthcare sanctuary was a few hours northeast in Valencia. The pamphlet was from the year prior, 1992, and it was an outpatient pamphlet for Enrique Anglés. And here's where the plot thickens. Enrique Anglés initially admitted to the murders, but after talking to the police for a while, they figured out that he really knew nothing at all about the girls and had some sort of mental handicap. This mental handicap was later diagnosed as schizophrenia, and the authorities knew that he wasn't the real killer because his story of events, or his confession, is that he was at the nightclub, or the cooler, with the girls, and after they refused to dance with them, he killed them. And this was a huge red flag immediately because the girls never made it to the nightclub that night. No one who was there saw them, and like I said earlier in this podcast, you would have had to buy a ticket beforehand to even get into the club. And because of this, Enrique wasn't the primary focus of the authorities for long. However, their attention did turn to someone he knew, his brother Antonio Anglés. Now, his brother was a known drug dealer and criminal, and the authorities quickly focused in on him and his friend Miguel Ricart. And another important thing to note here is that Antonio had not been confirmed to be seen for about a year. He was already a wanted fugitive for a few other crimes. And it would have made sense for Antonio to commit this crime because even his own family feared him. Even when Antonio's family was interviewed about him, they were fearful to say anything bad. Antonio's mother started to speak ill of him and talk about how scared she was of him and how dangerous he was. And one of her other children, one of Antonio's other siblings, signaled to her to stop talking because they were afraid that if Antonio found out that any of them were saying something bad about him, that he would come back from wherever he was and kill them. And Antonio already had a lengthy criminal history. Between 1985 and 1991, Antonio Anglés found himself behind bars on multiple occasions. His first two stints in April of 1985 and January of 1987 were due to receiving stolen items. Just months after his last incarceration in July of 1987, he was imprisoned again for drug trafficking. As time went on, Antonio's crime seemed to take a darker turn. In June of 1988, he faced a conviction for robbery with intimidation, which is kind of like our version of armed robbery. After spending about a year behind bars, he was released, only to return to prison in February of 1990. This time, his charges included resisting arrest and further drug trafficking. Now, you might be tempted to label Antonio Anglés as just any other troublemaker, but here's where things start to get murky. The year was 1990, and this horrific crime all started with a small bag of heroin. This crime was to a woman named Miriam. So, Antonio was a drug dealer, and because of that, he had a bag of heroin. And Miriam was a junkie, or she was an addict, and she took this bag of heroin, she stole it from him, and she used all of it. However, instead of handling that rationally, not that I know how drug dealers handle things rationally, but he kidnapped Miriam and chained her up to a post in a back room of his and tortured her for 25 hours. He kept beating her repeatedly, and he was not going to stop beating her. The only reason he stopped is because another one of his brothers, I believe there were 14 siblings total, went to the authorities and told them what Antonio was doing. After that, Antonio was given a 6-year sentence. However, he only ended up serving 1 year of that sentence. So Antonio was a dangerous man. So because of Antonio's violent past and because of his very long criminal history, authorities very well believed that there was a high possibility that he committed the Alcasser girls' murders. And although the authorities looked for Antonio, they could not find him anywhere, and to this day, Antonio has not been found. However, they found a friend of his named Miguel Ricart. And from the very get-go, Miguel Ricart's story didn't quite add up. When authorities went and first talked to Miguel, he said that there was no way that Enrique did it. Enrique would not hurt a fly. No matter what happened, he just wanted the authorities to know that Enrique was innocent. And then when police asked him what he was doing the night of November 13th of 1992, he said that he was having dinner with his girlfriend. However, his girlfriend denied his story and said, no, we were not having dinner together that night. So then Miguel changed his story once again, and this new story is that he was in jail that night. He must have forgotten he was in jail, and the authorities went back and they searched the record, and he was not in jail that night. However, he had been in jail around that period of time, but that specific night that the girls went missing, he was not in jail. So from the very start, Miguel was lying. And Miguel wasn't a completely innocent person. From the very beginning of his life, he had a very troubled childhood. His parents were both alcoholics, and he had a very rough home life. It was thought that having a difficult childhood led him to then become involved in very petty crimes like robbery. And he had a strong association with Antonio Anglés. For a while, they even lived together. And Antonio was also the one who supplied Miguel Ricart with drugs. Another circumstantial piece of evidence against Miguel is that he owned a small white sedan, and the last eyewitness who reportedly saw the girls alive, which was the older woman who lived in a home in Picassent, said that she saw the girls getting into a small white sedan with 2 men. And mind you, this all happened January 28th of 1993, the very next day after the girls' bodies were discovered. And that very same day, Miguel Ricart was charged with kidnapping and murder. And it wasn't long after that until Miguel started to confess. However, he put a lot of the blame on Antonio. But his confession of the murders and how things went came in stages, and he did change a lot of the details. For instance, during his first confession, he admitted that him and Antonio had picked the 3 girls up and then Antonio had driven them to a factory, where Antonio got out of the car and guided the girls one by one into the factory, where Antonio then killed them. However, apparently, according to the Miguel, he was in the car the entire time. But when authorities asked Miguel questions like how many shots were fired and how the frequency of the shots were fired, Miguel then made finger pistols with his hands and went boom, boom, boom. And he pointed his finger pistols downwards in execution style as though he had either seen it or done it himself. After that, his story continued to change. In another variation of the story, he said that Antonio made him rape Desirée. It really didn't seem like Miguel wanted to take accountability for his own actions. And no matter what version of the story he told, he continued to put most of the blame on Antonio. And a big thing to mention with Miguel's different confessions is that initially he tried to make everything between them and the girls sound consensual. So he said that the girls went with them willingly, and that Desirée went with him, Miguel, willingly, and that Tony and Miriam then went with Antonio willingly. And that they didn't try to fight back whatsoever. Which, between what the girls' intentions were that night, how old they were, and what was done to them, I call complete bullshit on that. But I suppose, according to him in his first confession, he said that him and Desirée had had sex, not that he had raped her. However, it was quickly changed to rape within the next 48 hours. And if you're starting to think that all of this sounds confusing and contradictory, it absolutely is. Miguel's confessions were all over the place. First, it was that he hadn't raped the girls, then it was that he had, then it was that Antonio had taken all 3 girls away and ended their lives, and then Miguel apparently just had Desirée, and Antonio had the 2 other girls, Miriam and Tony. It was very, very confusing, and his story just continued to change more and more. And I can't even tell you guys what Miguel did to Desirée after he raped her. It's unknown whether Miguel just ended her life or whether he brought her back to be with Tony and Miriam, or if after he was done he just brought her back to Antonio. And the other conflicting thing about all of this is that Miguel said that they had taken another vehicle, a blue Seat Ronda, which was a Spanish vehicle brand very similar to an older Honda Civic. And this completely contradicts the eyewitness statement of the small white sedan. The other huge unknown that authorities were trying to figure out in this case is where the girls were killed, because in the trench where they were found by the ruins of the house in La Ramona, there was really no signs that they were killed there. And all that Miguel really provided on this is that him and Antonio stopped by some house, grabbed a very large rug to wrap the girls' bodies in, and then dumped them in La Ramona. But here's what we know from the autopsies, which as we will soon learn were also mishandled. The autopsies were performed in the order in which the girls were found. They started with Tony, who was on top of the trench and was decapitated, and then they moved on to Desirée, and then they moved on to Miriam. The first things that the coroners noticed about Tony is that her hands had been bound behind her back. Her body showed signs of rape both vaginally and anally, but her hymen was still intact, and her cause of death was ruled as a gunshot wound to the skull. Like Tony, Desiree's body was found with her arms and her hands bound behind her back with a black rope, and one of her arms was bent at a very unnatural angle. Her autopsy was proving to be difficult because an animal had scavenged her remains. However, surprisingly, most of her clothing was intact. Also, like with Tony, Desiree's head was decapitated. An odd thing about Desiree's body is that her socks were missing and were nowhere to be found. The most shocking and horrifying thing about Desiree's autopsy is that her nipples had been removed with pliers. And this showed something about the killings. The killings were much more sadistic and less so opportunistic. To this day, it is speculated that their killings were part of some sort of ritual. Desiree's primary cause of death was also ruled as a gunshot wound to the head, although her body did also have stab wounds present. At 3:00 p.m. on January 28th of 1993, it was time for Miriam's autopsy. Similar to Desirée, Miriam was found without socks. And unlike Tony and Desirée, Miriam's head was still attached. However, Miriam had undergone some sort of violent beating. She had bruising all over her face, and even a few of her teeth were missing. Additionally, one of Miriam's hands was missing, and to this day, that hand has not been found. And to make matters worse, the ones who performed the autopsies on the girls cleansed all 3 of their bodies with water, so at the end of the autopsies, there was almost no DNA evidence left. Any DNA that would have been on their bodies was all washed away. And of the 7 different makeups of DNA that were found on the girls, none of that DNA matched Antonia Anglés or Miguel Ricart. However, because the ones performing the autopsies washed away potentially tons of DNA, it is unknown whether or not their DNA was linked to the girls or not. But nonetheless, Miguel Ricart was dragged into court and prosecuted for the girls' murders, all while the girls' families faced tons of scrutiny and just an overall lack of empathy from the media. News outlets were asking the girls' families how they felt to have their daughters murdered. They even asked one of Miriam's siblings to read out her poetry aloud for the news. They even asked Desiree's family how they felt about Desirée having her nipples taken off with pliers. The news outlets had little to no care about the girls' families or how they would even feel being asked those questions. Their main focus was getting more viewers and listeners. They did not care about the girls' families whatsoever. Their main goal was to make their news coverage as shocking as possible. And when Miguel Ricart gave his second official confession to the civil guard post, that is when the news outlets got even more frantic. In this confession, he gave so many more details. He said that him and Antonio had picked up all of the girls in Picassent around 8:00 p.m. and then driven them out to La Ramona. This time Miguel admitted that him and Antonio had threatened the girls. Antonio had also apparently hit one of them in the mouth with the butt of a gun, breaking her teeth. and this completely corroborated with Miriam's autopsy. And that is something that only one of the killers would know. Miguel also stated that they had traveled to an undetermined location to rape and torture the girls, and apparently the police didn't further press him on that. They didn't ask him to detail the torture, and they didn't ask him where that location was. Additionally, in the second confession, he said that they were driving the white sedan and not the blue car. However, no DNA evidence was found in that small white sedan. But to be completely honest, with how botched the rest of the investigation seemed, it wouldn't be surprising if that too was also botched. And years later, Miguel came out and said that the civil guard had actually pressured him into confessing. And since none of the interrogation was videotaped or properly documented, that very well could have happened. After all, a lot of this came out between 24 and 48 hours of the girls' bodies being found. And every time that Miguel changed his story, it was more and more like what the police wanted to hear. And during all of this, Antonia was reportedly seen multiple times. However, when police came to detain him as well, he allegedly jumped out of a 4-story window and once again escaped. At the time that he was seen, he had bleached blonde hair and was reportedly planning on dyeing it back to a darker brown to be less noticeable. Antonio even tried to get a room at a hostel named Baluda. However, the clerk at the hostel turned him away because he recognized him as Antonio Anglés. And once again, when authorities arrived at the hostel, Antonio was already gone. After that, Antonio apparently went to a place that he called the Hideout. And the Hideout was a location that he often shared with his brothers and Miguel Ricart. The Hideout was a large shed nearby a home owned by someone referred to as the Gypsy. And later authorities would theorize that the Hideout is where the girls were taken to be raped, tortured, and murdered. Now, who was the person who they referred to as Gypsy? Gypsy was apparently a criminal just like Antonio and Miguel, and his specialty was to be able to pawn off things, particularly stolen and illegal things. And Antonio reportedly showed up at the Hideout on January 30th of 1993, just a few days after the girls' bodies were discovered. And Antonio went there to ask the man who he called the Gypsy for a car. Antonio said that he needed a car to escape. However, what Antonio wasn't planning on was that the Gypsy would rat him out to the police. Yet once again, by the time that the police got there, Antonio was long gone. Now, the fourth place that Antonio tried to escape to was another hostel. And this was at some point between January 30th and February 4th of 1993. And police showed up on February 4th. But Antonio was prepared for them to show up, so when they arrived, he was already gone. However, he did leave behind a scene for the authorities to find. He left the bed that he was sleeping in at the hostel covered in pornographic magazines. After that, Antonio drastically changed his appearance once again and grew out his stubble for a week, got his hair all shaggy, and cut up his face. Prior to this, he was very clean cut. However, because his face was plastered everywhere, he was spotted and recognized by a truck driver, but he threatened that truck driver with a small axe. He forced that truck driver to give him a ride to where he wanted to go. And during that drive, he told the driver that he was being accused of the murder of the Alcasser girls and that he was entirely innocent and that he had not done it. Although he didn't go into much detail, the one thing he made clear is that his intention was to leave Spain altogether. And that is exactly what he did. While Antonio went on the run and presumably left the country altogether, Miguel was served with a sentence of 170 years. However, for whatever reason at the time, the maximum sentence you could serve in Spain was 30 years. And even of those 30 years, Miguel only ended up serving 21 years and got out of prison in 2013. And to this day, 31 years later, Antonio Anglés has never been found. However, in 2021, we got a good update on where he could be. Through various means, Antonio is thought to have made it from Spain to Portugal, and then according to a sailor, he hopped on a boat from Lisbon to Liverpool. The boat that he became a stowaway on was called the City of Plymouth. And on March 23rd of 1993 at 2:45 a.m., a British sailor named Joe Hannigan found Antonio Anglés rummaging through the kitchen looking for food. And at that point on March 23rd of 1993, the boat had already been set sail for 5 days. When Joe found who he now knows to be Antonio Anglés, he initially locked him in a room. And he thought that this was a good idea for the stowaway because the room only locked from the outside. However, when Joe returned a few hours later at 7:30 a.m., he found that Antonio had escaped. He escaped through a small port window that only led to the open ocean, and the boat circled back around to try to find Antonio, or who at the time they just knew as a stowaway. And they finally found him drifting on a raft off of the coast of Ireland. After that, he was taken aboard once again and held captive. When the boat docked in Dublin later that evening, the authorities were going to come on the boat to arrest the man. However, when the authorities got there and opened the door, once again he had escaped through the window. This time there was a rope leading from the window to the dock. But there's also another possible theory here too. And I say theory because this happened so long ago, and the British sailor named Joe Hannigan did not recognize Antonio Anglés as Antonio Anglés until many years later when he saw his picture. What everyone now is pretty certain of is that Antonio Anglés was on that boat. However, what is unknown is whether he escaped out of the port window the second time or whether he just jumped straight into the ocean. The reason for this confusion is that a life jacket with the city of Plymouth on it was found floating in the waters. And Antonio Anglés was a very strong swimmer, so authorities even believed that there was a high possibility that he just swam to shore. Oddly enough, after that, from 1993 to 1995, several women in Ireland started going missing. Is there a possibility that Antonio Anglés made it to shore and continued his horrific crimes? To be completely honest, we may never know. But what we can hope for is that someday the truth comes out about the Alcasser girls and that they get justice. The lives of Miriam, Tony, and Desirée were taken far too soon. And on a night that they were simply just trying to have fun together, their lives never should have came to a brutal end. And if you guys were able to make it this far to the end of the episode, I truly appreciate it, and thank you for listening to their story. I'm going to keep trying to increase the amount of podcasts I can put out for you guys per week because truly it is my passion to tell these stories, and hopefully get the victims of these horrific crimes justice. Okay, you guys, thank you once again. I will see you for next week's episode.